The Vatican has to be one of the most secret organizations in the history of the world. It guards its nasty little secrets, of which there are a great many.
For centuries, the Vatican has kept certain objects hidden from public view.
The Vatican are the most powerful and secretive country on the planet.
One relic in particular was never displayed, named, or explained.
The Vatican archives, whenever they're going to be opened, are going to reveal extraordinary levels of details.
When modern analysis was finally applied to it, the results did not clarify its purpose. They pointed towards something else entirely. Artificial intelligence identified patterns and structures that experts could not easily dismiss.
You can find actual documents that show that members of the Vatican helped Nazis escape.
What emerged were not clear explanations, but disturbing conclusions that forced researchers to rethink what the relic might actually be. The relic the Vatican never displayed. The Vatican is known around the world for its vast collection of religious relics. For centuries, pilgrims and scholars have been allowed to see bones of saints, fragments of ancient cloth, ceremonial objects, and items believed to be connected to the early Christian church.
And at the Vatican, a first for the faithful. Bones believed to be those of St. Peter, displayed publicly for the first time.
These relics are displayed openly in churches, museums, and archives. They are usually presented with explanations meant to strengthen faith and support the official history of Christianity. Yet according to multiple reports, these public relics represent only a small part of what the Vatican actually holds. Beyond what the public can see, there is a much more restricted group of objects. Within this group is a single relic that was never treated like sacred art. According to internal references, it was classified differently. Instead of being preserved for study or display, it was labeled as a controlled artifact. This label mattered. Sacred art is meant to be seen and interpreted. A controlled artifact is meant to be isolated. Access is tightly limited, and written records are kept to a minimum. Some believe this decision alone explains why almost no one outside a small internal circle knew the object existed. That classification shaped how the relic was handled. Unlike other relics, it was never placed in a chapel. It was never prepared for exhibition. It did not appear in catalogs available to visiting scholars. Even researchers who were granted rare access to restricted Vatican collections were not told about it. The object was never given a public name. Internal records reportedly referred to it only by coded inventory numbers. The way the relic was discovered followed the same pattern of control. It was found during restricted excavations beneath Vatican territory. These excavations were not open to the public and were never announced as archaeological projects. The work was carried out quietly under Vatican authority, not under independent academic supervision. When the object was uncovered, its discovery was recorded internally and then sealed. Soon after, references to the excavation were reportedly removed from public archaeological records. After that, there was no explanation. No public statement was issued about the relic. It was not labeled a forgery. It was not condemned as heretical. There was no theological ruling of any kind. In earlier periods, objects considered dangerous to church teaching were openly discussed and clearly rejected. This one was not. According to those familiar with Vatican archival practices, the relic was not dismissed. It was simply placed out of reach. Some believe this response points to uncertainty rather than confidence. The relic was not destroyed or erased from internal records. It was carefully preserved and stored under conditions that suggest long-term importance. To some observers, this level of caution suggests the Vatican was unsure how to interpret the relic, not confident that it understood it. What made this relic different from every other artifact was not where it was found, but what it was made of and what was carved into it. An object that did not fit Christian tradition. When the relic was finally placed in front of examiners, the reaction was immediate. This was not an object that behaved like anything they had handled before. It was solid, engraved, and unusually heavy for its size. It was not shaped to be held during prayer or lifted for display. There was no clear top or bottom, and no obvious front or back. Those present struggled to determine how it was meant to be positioned. From its physical form alone, the object felt wrong for a religious setting. That sense of unease deepened when attention turned to the surface. The engravings did not resemble Christian imagery in any recognizable way. There were no crosses, no images of Christ, no saints, and no scenes drawn from Scripture. This absence was alarming. Even obscure relics usually contain some visual link to belief. This object did not. The surface was covered in tightly arranged markings that looked structured but unfamiliar. They appeared as a mixture of characters, some resembling letters, others resembling numbers, and others not matching any known system at all. Those who examined it could not agree on whether they were looking at writing or something else entirely. Initial attempts were made to understand the markings as language, but they led nowhere. Religious texts usually follow clear patterns. They tell stories, express prayer, or explain belief. The markings on this object did none of those things. Latin did not fit. Greek was ruled out. Hebrew also failed to match. The symbols did not form sentences or recognizable grammatical structures. This raised immediate concern. Researchers then tried to place the object within known historical traditions. Some believed it might be Roman. Roman artifacts usually carry marks of authority such as seals, names, or official symbols. This relic showed none of that. Others suggested a pre-Christian origin. However, pre-Christian ritual objects usually display repeated ceremonial symbols or signs of worship use. This object showed no such behavior. Its markings were consistent and controlled, suggesting deliberate planning rather than ritual repetition. Closer inspection revealed another troubling detail. Portions of the surface appeared damaged, but not in ways consistent with age. Early records indicate that the worn areas appeared in specific locations and followed similar patterns. This did not resemble natural erosion. It appeared focused, as if certain markings had been removed while others were left intact. This raised early fears that the object had already been altered. There were also no signs that the relic had ever been used in worship. It showed no smoothing from repeated handling, no residue from oils or incense, and no marks linked to ceremonial contact. Some believe it was created for a purpose rather than devotion. After these initial examinations, the relic was set aside, not because it lacked importance, but because every attempt to study it led to deeper problems that no one was prepared to confront. Why human analysis reached a dead end. The relic raised more questions than answers, and every immediate approach led to uncertainty. Rather than force a conclusion, the object was secured and flagged for further review, awaiting a method that could move beyond first impressions. Linguists were the first to take control of the process. One of the lead figures was a Vatican-affiliated language specialist known for working with damaged and obscure texts. His task was to treat the engravings as a possible lost language or an advanced coded system. Each symbol was documented, indexed, and compared against known alphabets and writing families. Patterns were mapped. Frequencies were analyzed. The results were discouraging. The markings showed internal order, but they did not behave like any known language. They could not be translated, and they could not be reduced to a cipher. After months of work, no readable structure emerged. Historians were then brought in to solve a different problem. Even when language fails, artifacts can usually be placed within a cultural timeline. Style, technique, and context often provide clues. In this case, those clues conflicted. Some aspects of the engravings suggested extreme precision, while others appeared intentionally incomplete. The object did not align with early Christian traditions. It also failed to match Roman, Greek, or Near Eastern timelines. Each comparison led to contradictions rather than clarity. Material experts examined the relic next. Internal reviews noted that its composition did not behave as expected. Some properties suggested long-term stability beyond what would normally be expected for an object of its assumed age. Other areas showed signs of alteration that could not be explained by natural wear alone. Experts could not agree on whether the material had been modified, preserved through unknown methods, or deliberately engineered in a way they could not identify. Advanced imaging was eventually used to study the surface in greater detail. What it revealed deepened the problem. The engravings were layered. Some markings appeared beneath others, as if added at different times. Yet, the precision remained consistent across layers. In several areas, symbols overlapped in ways that did not make sense for hand engraving. The sequence of markings did not follow a clear progression, suggesting repeated intervention rather than continuous work. Further analysis revealed more inconsistencies. Some symbols appeared unfinished, as if deliberately stopped. Others were repeated with exact spacing and depth. Specialists familiar with engraving techniques noted that this level of uniformity is highly unusual for manual work. No guiding tool or reference system could be identified. As findings accumulated, the problem became clear. Each discipline saw something different, and none of their conclusions aligned. Internal meetings meant to unify the findings only exposed deeper contradictions. There was no single explanation that could account for language, material, structure, and modification at the same time. That dead end held for years, until a new kind of tool entered the picture, one that did not rely on belief, tradition, or interpretation. The decision to involve artificial intelligence. After years of stalled analysis, the relic entered a new phase for reasons that had nothing to do with solving its mystery. The object was digitally scanned to create a permanent record in case of damage or loss. This was standard procedure for sensitive artifacts. At the time, no one expected the scans to answer questions that human experts could not. The scanning process itself was thorough. High-resolution imaging captured the surface down to the smallest variations in depth and spacing. Unlike photographs, these scans recorded exact measurements. They revealed details that could not be seen by the naked eye or even under magnification. Tiny differences in engraving depth, alignment, and spacing became visible for the first time. According to those familiar with the process, the object began to look less random and more deliberate the closer it was examined digitally. As analysts reviewed the digital models, something unexpected emerged. Portions of the engravings that had once been dismissed as decorative began to show clear structure. Lines aligned across different sections of the surface, shapes repeated at consistent intervals. Patterns appeared to continue beneath areas that had been worn or altered. According to unverified reports, this was the first moment when some began to suspect the markings were part of a larger system, rather than isolated symbols. It was at this stage that a new idea was reportedly raised. Instead of trying to interpret the markings through history, language, or belief, what if they were treated purely as data? According to reports, a proposal was made to run the digital scans through an artificial intelligence analysis system. The goal was not translation, it was pattern recognition. This was a significant shift in approach. The system chosen for the task was not trained on theology, scripture, or religious symbolism. According to those familiar with the setup, it had no background in Christian history or ancient languages. It was designed to detect structure, repetition, and anomalies in complex data sets.
The ancient cuneiform script on the outside of that tablet.
But it's the 3D model, constructed from these data, that is truly remarkable.
To avoid bias, it was given no historical context and no explanation of what the object was believed to be. The engravings were fed into the system as raw visual and spatial information only. This decision caused unease among some observers. According to reports, there were concerns about applying a modern analytical tool to an ancient religious artifact. Others worried about what conclusions might emerge if the system detected patterns no human had noticed. Despite these concerns, the process moved forward quietly. The AI processed the data differently than any human expert had. It did not attempt to assign meaning or symbolism. It compared spacing, alignment, frequency, and layering across the entire surface at once. According to unverified accounts, it treated the engravings the same way it would treat any unfamiliar structured input. What the system returned was unexpected. It did not offer a translation. It did not identify a language. Instead, it produced a classification output. According to reports, the system flagged the engravings as exhibiting properties inconsistent with random or decorative marking. It identified levels of precision, repetition, and structural dependency that exceeded what it typically associates with manual inscription. For those reviewing the results, the reaction was immediate and uneasy. The AI had not explained what the markings meant. It had raised a different concern altogether. Instead of identifying meaning, the AI identified something far more disturbing about the nature of the markings themselves. The first AI result that alarmed researchers. When the digital scans were finally processed, the first result did not arrive in the way anyone expected. The AI did not attempt to translate the engravings or assign meaning to them. There were no suggested words, no guessed phrases, and no symbolic interpretations. Instead, the system returned a technical classification report. For those reviewing it, this was the first clear sign that something was wrong. The AI flagged the engravings as having no identifiable historical precedent. This alone caused unease. Most ancient markings, even when undeciphered, still show links to earlier systems. Languages grow from older languages. Symbols evolve from earlier symbols. Here, the system could find no such lineage. There was no traceable ancestry. The engravings did not belong to any known family of writing or symbolic tradition. As the analysis continued, the system attempted to align the markings with existing databases. These included known alphabets, ancient number systems, ritual symbols, and decorative scripts.
While archaeologists searched for a better solution, many ancient texts remained unopened and unread.
None of these comparisons produced meaningful overlap. The engravings did not resemble religious imagery, administrative markings, or artistic patterns. They did not behave like writing meant to be read by people, nor like symbols meant to be recognized visually. What troubled reviewers further was the AI's assessment of structure. The system noted that the markings did not show signs of gradual development. Human writing systems usually begin in simple forms and become more refined over time. This object showed no such progression. Certain sequences appeared fully formed, precise, and consistent across the surface. There was no visible experimentation or transition. The AI also identified internal rules governing how the markings were arranged. These rules were consistent, but unfamiliar. They did not match known patterns of human communication. Human languages allow variation and flexibility. These engravings followed strict constraints that allowed none. The system flagged this rigidity as unusual. At this stage, the AI generated a conclusion that immediately raised concern. It suggested that the engravings were not symbolic in origin. This did not mean they lacked meaning. It meant that meaning was not their primary function. Symbols are designed to represent ideas. These markings appeared designed to enforce structure. For those reviewing the output, that distinction was deeply unsettling. The reaction within the review team shifted quickly. What had begun as a technical exercise now felt like a warning. Discussions grew tense. Some questioned whether the system was misclassifying the data. Others feared it was identifying something no one had prepared for. Continuing the analysis without understanding the implications no longer felt safe. As a result, the process was paused. This was not a permanent halt, but a deliberate stop. The first AI output had not solved the mystery, it had deepened it. What emerged from the analysis? When the analysis resumed, the tone inside the review process changed. The AI was no longer being used only to classify structure. It began isolating repeated formations across the entire surface of the engravings. These were not single symbols, but clusters that appeared together again and again, even across damaged or altered sections. The system treated these repetitions as intentional rather than coincidental. As the clusters were mapped, the AI identified a recurring numerical pattern. Internal summaries showed that the number 66 appeared more frequently than statistical probability would normally allow. It was not scattered randomly. It appeared in fixed positions, often linked to the same groupings of symbols. In several cases, the number remained intact even where surrounding engravings had been worn down or removed. This consistency raised immediate concern among those monitoring the output. Rather than interpreting the number on its own, the AI analyzed how it interacted with the surrounding markings. The system treated the number as a structural anchor. When the related symbol clusters were processed together, the AI generated what it described as sentence-level constructs. These were not translations in the traditional sense. They were reconstructed statements based on internal rules the system detected within the engravings. The first reconstructed sentence read, "When the count is complete, what is sealed will break."
It tells us basically in 3 different scripts, 2 languages, that the king should be treated as a god.
The wording was brief and direct. It did not resemble prayer, worship, or instruction. It appeared declarative. Those reviewing the output noted that the sentence was flagged as conditional. It described an outcome triggered by completion, not belief or action. The second reconstructed sentence followed closely behind. It read, "After the breaking, there is no return, only the end of order." This sentence was treated by the system as dependent on the first. The AI identified a clear sequence. One condition had to be fulfilled before the second outcome occurred. There was no indication of mercy, reversal, or alternative path within the structure. The wording immediately caused alarm. Although the sentences did not match any known biblical translation, several researchers noted parallels to themes found in the Book of Revelation. These included ideas of sealing, breaking, final stages, and irreversible change. Some specialists warned against drawing direct religious connections. Others argued that the thematic overlap could not be ignored. What made the situation worse was the AI's own assessment. The system flagged both sentences as structurally intentional. This meant they were not the result of pattern drift or accidental alignment. At the same time, the AI classified them as contextually undefined. It could not determine when the statements applied, who authored them, or what physical or conceptual process they described. There was no reference point for time or scale. Reactions among those involved became tense. Some felt the AI was assembling meaning where none existed. Others worried that the system had identified a framework humans were not equipped to understand. Debates broke out over whether continuing the analysis would clarify the findings or deepen the confusion. What was clear is that the reconstructed sentences did not resolve anything. They did not explain the relic. They complicated it. Instead of answers, they introduced implications that no one was prepared to confront. Why the findings were never agreed upon. Once the reconstructed number and sentences were presented, the investigation shifted from analysis to disagreement.
So we have this very interesting interaction between these languages. We think that the text probably originally is a Greek text.
The room divided almost immediately. What the AI had produced was not treated as a discovery, but as a problem. Some analysts focused less on what the sentences said, and more on whether the system itself should have been trusted. One group argued that the results reflected pattern overfitting. In their view, the AI had been given a complex set of markings and forced order where none truly existed. They warned that advanced systems are capable of finding structure even in randomness. To them, the number and sentences were not revelations, but artifacts of computation. They insisted that without historical context, no output could be treated as meaningful. Others strongly disagreed. These researchers pointed to the consistency of the results. The same number appeared across different sections of the engravings, including areas that were damaged or partially erased. The reconstructed sentences also emerged independently from separate clusters of symbols. To them, this level of consistency made coincidence unlikely. They argued that even if meaning was unclear, intention was difficult to dismiss. The disagreement deepened when biblical parallels were raised. Several experts warned against linking the sentences to religious texts of any kind. They argued that drawing connections to the Book of Revelation introduced bias and fear into what should remain technical analysis. These experts insisted that any resemblance was superficial and driven by interpretation rather than evidence. Others countered that the AI itself had no awareness of theology or scripture. It had not been trained on religious texts. It had no reason to favor apocalyptic themes. To some observers, that made the output more disturbing, not less. If the system reached those sentences without religious framing, then the parallels could not be dismissed as projection alone. As discussions continued, no shared conclusion formed. Some believed the sentences were symbolic. Others believed they described conditions rather than events. A few suggested the structure resembled a process rather than a message. None of these interpretations could be verified or dismissed. Every explanation introduced new questions instead of closing old ones. What could be agreed on, however, was more limited and more troubling. The engravings were not random. The number recurrence was not accidental. The reconstructed sentences were not produced from a single damaged area, but emerged consistently across the object. Whatever the relic represented, it had been designed with structure, intent, and internal logic. At that point, the disagreement was no longer about whether the findings were real, but about what they implied. The Vatican intervened. Further analysis was halted. Access to the data was restricted. The relic was moved into deeper containment under tighter controls. Officially, the findings were classified as inconclusive. What remained was a narrow and unsettling consensus. The object was not symbolic decoration. It was not a devotional relic, and it was not meaningless. It appeared to be something constructed to function in a way no one could fully define. The relic was sealed again, not because its message was understood, but because the evidence suggested it was never meant to be interpreted safely. If you enjoyed watching this video, kindly like and subscribe to the channel.